World War II went from the 1st of September 1939 to the 2nd of September 1945 from when Hitler invaded Poland to when the official documents were signed. And it resulted in 80 million on the order of 18 million civilian and military deaths, which is almost twice that of World War One. So World War II was quite a bloody and gruesome conflict, perhaps one of the worst in all of human history. And what were some of the causes of World War II? Why did World War II even happen in the first place? Causes of World War II. Causes of World War II. And it was mostly due to Hitler. And fundamentally, the most fundamental cause of World War II was Hitler's foreign policy aims, his aggressive foreign policy aims. So let's take a look at some of these right now. So his first aim was Lebensraum, which was literally translates to the desire for living space. So the idea was that Germany was not big enough for its population, so it needed to expand. Expansion would take place eastwards into Poland and the USSR. So there was a lot of free land to be captured there relatively easily. And this relates to the invasion of Poland, which actually started World War II on the 1st of September 1939. And the invasion of the USSR was justified by Lebensraum, and this was on the 22nd of June 1941. And this was one of Hitler's most risky moves in World War II. His second foreign policy aim was Greater Germany, which was basically the belief that all German speakers should actually live in Germany. And this justifies his intentions to recapture the Sudetenland, which were the parts of Czechoslovakia where there were mostly German speakers, and Austria, because Austria is fundamentally a German-speaking nation. And he also wanted to take back some of their territories that were taken away by Versailles, such as the Polish corridor and Danzig, where, again, there were many German speakers. And under this foreign policy aim of Greater Germany, were his justification for trying to take back these nations, particularly the Sudetenland and Austria, which we will look at soon. His third foreign policy aim was autarky, which is simply the belief that Germany should be economically self-sufficient, so it needs all the resources necessary for their economy to function. So this meant that they would need to expand eastwards into the USSR to gain access to oil. And one of the fundamental reasons for autarky is because Hitler doesn't want a repeat of the naval blockades, which absolutely crippled Germany in World War One. He wants Germany to be economically self-sufficient, to be able to run its economy by itself, have all the necessary resources it needs to function, so that any attempt by its enemies, by Germany's enemies, to use naval blockades would be ineffective because they're essentially able to support themselves. Another aim was anti-communism. So this meant Germany was against the USSR, as the USSR was actually the only communist nation before 1945. But the Germans and the NSDAP stood strong against communism. Hitler also made it clear to the German people, which was one of the reasons he rose to power, that he wanted to reverse the Treaty of Versailles, which everyone in Germany condemned at the time. So he wanted to reverse the reparations, reverse the war guild, reverse the military restrictions, reverse the territorial losses, and reverse the weaponry restrictions which were enforced by Versailles. And his final foreign policy aim was a master race, which meant he thought German people were superior and that foreigners and other people were inferior and should be treated as such. Some more causes of World War II were the long-term consequences of the peace treaties from 1919 to 1923, which were influenced by the Big Four. So the problem with some of these long-term peace treaties was that it created a lot of disappointed powers. It created several disappointed powers, and we'll go over those right now. So Japan was a disappointed power. One of the reasons it was disappointed with these peace treaties was that the Big Four rejected their proposal of a racial equality clause to appear in the Treaty of Versailles. They also failed to gain influence in China after World War I. Clearly, they would have wanted to expand their territory and gain influence in China, but they failed to do so. This made them a revisionist power. For instance, in September 1931, it invaded Manchuria, On the 7th of July 1937, there was a Sino-Japanese war. Some people mark this as the beginning of World War One, though it's generally accepted as when Germany invaded Poland. And on the 7th of December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the US into the war. We also have Italy being a disappointed power. From the peace treaties, it expected a greater share of Yugoslavia, the Ottoman Empire, and Germany, but it received relatively little territory after World War One. So it was a revisionist power, and on October 1935, it invaded Abyssinia, as we've seen from the League of Nations. Obviously, we also have Germany being an unhappy power as a result of the peace treaties. Every single aspect of Versailles, reparation, war guilt, military restrictions, weaponry restrictions, territorial losses, they all created bitterness in Germany, which was sure to lead to uprising. And Germany was obviously a revisionist power, as seen from all of Hitler's actions post-1933, and from Locarno in 1925, where it actually stated that it was only happy with its western borders and that it could possibly invade its eastern borders. And fundamentally, one of the most significant causes of World War II was the failure to prevent Germany from regaining its status as a powerful European state. So one of the fundamental causes of World War II was the Allies' failure to prevent Germany from regaining its status as a powerful European state, so that should be noted. So how did France act as a result of the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923? What were the long-term consequences on France? Well, they always wanted Versailles to be harsher, which is quite obvious. By the mid-1930s, it was clear that Hitler wanted to overturn the treaty. He was becoming increasingly aggressive, and France felt that it couldn't stand up to Germany on its own, and so it acted in partnership with the UK. And so in the UK was somewhat more compassionate towards Germany than France was after the peace treaties. By the mid-1930s, the idea that Versailles was unpopular had gained that by the mid-1930s, the idea that Versailles was unfair had gained popularity. So lots of people in the UK thought Versailles was unfair. The Nazis were seen as a natural response, a purely natural reprisal, a natural response to the excessive punishment of 1919 via Versailles. And the UK would actually aid Germany in a peaceful revision of the Treaty of Versailles. For instance, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 guaranteed Germany and Navy 35% of that of the British Navy. So these are all more reasons why World War II occurred. We've got these disappointed powers, these revisionist powers who wanted to commit aggressive actions as a result of the peace treaties. And we also have the UK who actually wanted to help Germany, which only strengthened Germany and led to the policy of appeasement. Now, another major reason World War II occurred was because of the failure of the League of Nations. This was another cause of World War II, and let's go into more depth. So if we look at September 1931, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, this was clearly the first serious challenge to the League. I mean, it had been able to deal with pretty simple problems, the islands, things like that in 1920, but this was the first serious challenge because of the distances involved. Now, Japan realized that there was really little the League could do to stop its expansion, since the USA and USSR weren't even members of the League. Even when the USSR did join in 1934, its priorities were internal rather than external. You couldn't really be bothered helping Japan. And to Germany and Italy, the lesson of Manchuria was that expansion was possible. So this Manchurian invasion set a precedent to the other aggressive leaders of Italy and Germany that they could in fact expand. And to Hitler, it was a lesson that he could pursue Lebensraum. If we look at the October 1935 Italian invasion of Abyssinia, it proved that the limited sanctions the League tried to enforce were basically ineffective. It didn't really do anything. It didn't really harm Italy in any way, these limited sanctions. The Hohe-Laval Pact highlighted the British and French self-interest. It proved that it was impossible to put internationalism ahead of their own national interest, their own ways to deal with this problem, rather than actually trying to help the invaded country. They just had self-interest. and it proved that further expansionism was now likely in Abyssinia. Now, if we look at the failure of collective security, this basically led to rearmament. The failure of collective security, or the League members acting together effectively against aggression, meant that the UK and France would have to rearm themselves to try and deter aggression from other nations. Since collective security collapsed, no one was willing to help each other when aggressive nations arose. Collective security failed, so the UK and France just decided to rearm themselves. And another impact of the failure of the League, which was a cause of World War II, was appeasement. So rearmament itself would not stop aggression on its own, and it was unlikely to be complete for a number of years, particularly in the UK. So therefore, the policy of appeasement was needed for the time being. They just needed to let Germany do what it was doing. It didn't want to act against Germany because it was still rearming itself. And appeasement was one of the massive reflections of the League's failure. Appeasement massively reflected the failure of the League. And it was one of the fundamental causes of World War II, just letting Germany get stronger, letting Germany rearm. So let's take a look at some of the ways Germany prepared for war by 1936. So in 1933, he withdrew from the League of Nations. Also in 1933, he withdrew from the Disarmament Conference. In 1934, Germany started to build tanks and warships. In 1935, conscription was reintroduced, so people were forced to join the army if the state told them to. And this was one of the banned things that was mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles. So we were actually revoking the Treaty of Versailles here by reintroducing conscription. Also in 1935, we have the Luftwaffe founded, which is literally translate to air weapon, and this is the foundation of the German Air Force, which was one of their ways of preparing for war. By 1936, they had managed to gather 600,000 soldiers, 6 times the amount permitted by the Treaty of Versailles. I should also mention in 1935, which should go a little bit earlier, but nonetheless, in 1935, we have the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which guaranteed Germany 35% of the navy of that of the UK, and this was one of the ways Hitler wanted to prepare for war, by expanding the size of their navy, and he did this by legal means, but nonetheless it is still preparation for war. And in 1936, we'll go into more detail later, but we have the Rhineland March, the invasion of the Rhineland. Germany goes straight into the Rhineland, which is a demilitarized zone, so this was another way they prepared for war by 1936. So let's take a look at the Saarland plebiscite, and this was held in January 1935. Now, the Saarland was obviously a major industrial region and produced a lot of coal, which after the League of Nations, after the Treaty of Versailles, this area went to the League of Nations, and all the coal it produced would go directly to France, which really helped to cripple Germany's economy. Nonetheless, it was given to the League in 1919 for 15 years. So 15 years later, we have January 1935, and there was a plebiscite held, and 90% of the population, a vast 90%, voted to rejoin Germany and be under control of Hitler. So this was a massive victory for Hitler, and it really gave him a self-confidence boost. Let's try and work through a general timeline of some of Hitler's foreign policy aims between 1933 and 1939. So in September 1931, we have the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, as we've seen. So this set the precedent that aggression could work for Germany. And in February 1933, the same year, Hitler introduces a program of rearmament. So he starts to rearm Germany. In October 1933, Hitler leaves the League and walks out of the Disarmament Conference. So this is pretty significant here. The other people in the League of Nations, Britain and France, are probably pretty skeptical at this point. Hitler is trying to prepare for war. In January 1934, Germany signs a non-aggression pact with Poland. So why does it do this? Basically because it takes pressure off of Hitler. Hitler obviously doesn't want to start a war with Poland for now. He kind of really wants to focus on the Western Front. So the West does end up declaring war on Hitler for his aggressive foreign policy. He won't get into a two-front war with Poland. It takes a lot of pressure off of him. In January 1934, the USSR joins the League of Nations, basically because it wants security from Hitler. It ends up getting kicked out later on after it invades Finland. But it joins because it wants security from Hitler. It didn't join in the first place because it didn't really help in the war and because it was communist. No one really liked it. But now it did end up joining in 1934 because it wanted security from Hitler. And in July 1934, we have attempts to Anschluss with Austria. We have Germany's attempt, we have Hitler's attempt to take over Austria. So the Austrian Nazis actually murder Dollfuss, who is the Austrian Chancellor. So the supporters of the Nazis actually murder the Chancellor Dollfuss. And it's actually backed down, the Anschluss is backed down after pressure from Mussolini via the Stresa Front. So the Stresa Front was basically the UK, France, and Italy opposing German revoking of the Treaty of Versailles. So that was backed down by Mussolini originally, the first attempt. In January 1935, the Saarland Germans vote to return the area back to Germany, as we've seen. So that was in January 1935. In March 1935, we have conscription reintroduced and 600,000 men army. In March 1935, we have the Luftwaffe founded. Also in March 1935, the Stresa Front, UK, France, Italy, against German violations of Versailles, as I said. Also in March 1935, the USSR and France sign a mutual assistance pact. Basically, they want security against Germany just in case Germany decides to be aggressive towards either one of them. So the USSR and France have a common enemy, which is Germany. So there's sort of negative cohesion going on here. Also in March 1935, the USSR and Czechoslovakia sign a mutual assistance pact. Same reason, both of them fear Germany, and also because Czechoslovakia is a close ally of Russia because they're both of Slavic descent. And in June 1935, we have the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. So this basically guarantees Germany and Navy 35% of that of the UK. So this is an example of appeasement from the United Kingdom. In March 1936, the German troops invade and remilitarize the Rhineland. In summer 1936, Germany sends military aid to Franco in Spain. In August 1936, Hitler creates a 4-year plan to prepare Germany for war. In November 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. They both hate communism. It's basically both showing their dislike for communism. And also in November 1936, Germany and Italy signed the Rome-Berlin Axis. So this is what the Allies didn't want. The Allies didn't want Italy to ally with Germany. They didn't want Italy to kind of unite with Germany. So after the Rome-Berlin Axis, it was clear that the Stresa Front had collapsed. The Allies had failed to keep Germany and Italy away from unification. In March 1938, we have the Anschluss with Austria. So the Germans do actually end up successfully violating the Treaty of Versailles and taking over Austria. In October 1938, with the Sudeten crisis, which results in the Munich Conference, where the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia is actually handed over to Germany. And in March 1939, the German troops just invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. And Lithuania gives Memel, which is a port city in Lithuania, to Germany. And the UK and France guarantee to support Poland if it is invaded by Germany. And in May 1939, Germany signs the Pact of Steel with Italy. So this is basically a formal alliance with Italy against everyone else. And in August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was signed. We'll go into that in further detail later, but Germany and the USSR both decide to carve up their spheres of influence in Poland. And on the 1st of September 1939, Germany actually invades Poland, which means the British and French stay true to their word. They guarantee to support Poland. So the British and French said, hey, Germany, we're going to give you a day to get out, a couple of days to get out of Poland. If you don't, we're going to declare war on you. The Germans stayed in Poland. So 2 days later, on the 3rd of September 1939, the British and the French keep to their word and they declare war on Germany. Let's take a look at Hitler's 1936 invasion or remilitarization of the Rhineland. So why did Hitler do this? Obviously, the Rhineland, marching into the Rhineland was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. The Rhineland was on the border between France and Germany. It was created to really alleviate border tension between France and Germany. So why did Hitler invade the Rhineland in 1936? So the first reason was that it was justified by the Franco-Soviet Treaty, so the French and Russian alliance, which acted as a threat to Hitler. So he said, hey, you've created this alliance, so I'm just going to go ahead and invade the Rhineland. It's justified by your threat to me. Secondly, the reversal of Versailles was popular in Germany. It was one of Hitler's foreign policy aims, and it's one of the ways he managed to get to power. So he had to act on his promises. And the reversal of Versailles was popular, so he just went ahead and invaded the Rhineland. Another reason they remilitarized the Rhineland is because the UK and France at the time were distracted by the October 1935 Italian invasion of Abyssinia. So it was a good time to really invade the Rhineland. Final reason is because France wouldn't actually intervene against Germany without the support of the UK. But the UK wouldn't intervene in the first place because it really agreed with the Germans. It didn't like that. It thought the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, and it sympathized with Germany. For instance, in 1935, we had the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which guaranteed the Germans a navy 35% the size of that of the UK. So there was some sympathizing from the UK, which meant France wouldn't really intervene without the UK's support. One thing to note about this is if France had resisted, Germany would have had to retreat. Germany wasn't strong enough. So it was a bit of a gamble, this invasion of the Rhineland. But it was successful because France didn't resist. And originally the German army had given advice to Hitler not to invade the Rhineland, but Hitler ignored the German army's advice, the German military's advice. So this was a propaganda success for him. He ignored their advice. I want to talk about the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939. We know overseas interest was based on a clear left-right division. So on the right-wing government of this in Spain was supported by Germany and Italy, obviously, because Germany and Italy are far right. Hitler sent transport planes to carry Franco, who was the right-wing leader at the time, and his troops from Morocco to Spain, so Morocco in Africa up to Spain. The Germans and Italians also supplied troops, planes, and equipment to support the right. Now, the right was led by Francisco Franco. Now, the right attempted to overthrow the legitimate government of Spain, which was the left. Now, the left was supported by the USSR. Obviously, the USSR is communist. The left is more communist. So the USSR, similar to what Germany and Italy did, sent weapons, pilots, and planes to the left. And it was also supported by the International Brigades, which is a paramilitary group set up by communists, which sided with the left, which sided with the Popular Front. The left was known as a Popular Front. So the left was the actual legitimate government of Spain at the time, and it was known as a Popular Front. It was known as a Popular Front, and it was the amalgamation of left-wing parties, so amalgamation, joining together, the combination of left-wing parties such as socialists and communists. So the UK and France actually wouldn't intervene in the Spanish Civil War. So firstly, it was suspicious of the communist-backed Spain. Communists obviously ran the country at the time. The Popular Front was a legitimate government. They also wouldn't intervene because they wished to keep Mussolini away from Germany. Okay, so let's take a look at what Hitler hoped to achieve and what Hitler actually achieved by intervening and trying to help the right by trying to assist Franco in the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939. So Hitler hoped that Spain would become a German ally. It if Franco won, providing a hostile power on France's border. It would also give Germany access to Spanish naval bases. So if Germany did get itself into a war, having Spain on its side would be relatively nice, especially since it's right next to France. In reality, after the Spanish Civil War, after Franco succeeded, Spain was in a relatively difficult economic situation, so it didn't really want to join World War II, and it failed to become an ally of Germany and remain neutral during the war. Hitler also hoped to use the Spanish Civil War as an opportunity to really test his armed forces to prepare for a full-scale European war. So he wanted to, use all his weapons and all of his armed forces against the right-wing government to help Franco. And this would basically prepare himself for a full-scale European war. For instance, the Luftwaffe, he could test that. And the Condor Legion was one of the German planes which supported the nationalists. And he could work on his blitzkrieg tactics, which was lightning war, which was really ended trench warfare and massively changed the role during World War II. So Germany did manage to actually do this. For instance, the Luftwaffe developed dive bombing, which is targeting a specific area, and carpet bombing a more general open area. And they did this in Guernica. They completely destroyed Guernica in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And they managed to practice their blitzkrieg tactic, which was attacking a small area with overwhelming force. Blitzkrieg literally translates to war of mobility. War of mobility using tanks, artillery, and air power. To attack a small area with overwhelming force, break through enemy lines, and cause chaos behind enemy lines. And they managed to use this in the Battle of Bilbao, which is in Basque Country north of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Hitler hoped that since Germany and Italy operated together in Spain, they're on the same side, they were on the right. Hitler hoped that the Spanish Civil War, might detach Italy from the UK and France. And this eventually happened. Italy eventually detached itself from the UK and France. In 1936, they signed the Rome-Berlin Axis, which meant Germany and Italy would pursue their common foreign policy. And in 1939, they had a formal alliance with the Pact of Steel, which was precisely what the UK and France were wanting to avoid with things like the Stresa Front. Hitler hoped that a long Spanish Civil War would distract Western diplomats from the events occurring in Central Europe. And this worked out. Hitler did manage to pursue his aggressive foreign policy, and he took much of Central Europe in the Spanish Civil War period between 1936 and 1939, although it could be argued that there were other reasons other than the Spanish Civil War that his aggressive foreign policy was not met by much retribution, such as the Great Depression, such as appeasement, things like that. But the Spanish Civil War did indeed distract Western diplomats, and Hitler managed to pursue his aggressive foreign policy in this time period and took over much of Central Europe. Hitler also believed that UK non-interventionism in the Spanish Civil War would eventually lead to a UK-German alliance or UK neutrality in a future war, which was interesting because that never happened. Nonetheless, it is noteworthy. Let's take a look at Hitler's Anschluss with Austria, Hitler's political union with Austria, which occurred in March of 1938. So in March 1938, Hitler sent German troops into Austria. A plebiscite was held and 99.75% of Austrians voted to unite after the German takeover. So some people say this figure is a bit shady, it's a bit too high. It might have been manipulated by the Germans, but this is the result nonetheless. The Anschluss was boosted by the successes of 1936 in particular. For instance, in March we had the invasion of the Rhineland, and in November the Rome-Berlin Axis between Italy and Germany to pursue common foreign policy. So Mussolini actually stopped Hitler's first Anschluss attempt with Austria which occurred in July 1934. Italy put it down originally by the Stresa Front, which was between the UK, France, and Italy to stop German violations of Versailles. So Mussolini originally stopped him by the Stresa Front in July 1934. So the Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg actually appealed to the UK and France when Germany invaded. UK and France actually failed to provide support, so we hence have the plebiscite, where a supposed 99.75% of Austrians voted to reunite with Germany. Now, Hitler did this because it followed Lebensraum, getting more living space, Greater Germany, uniting Germans, and Hitler was Austrian himself, so he wanted Austria to be part of Germany. And the Austrians spoke German, so Austria is a fundamentally German-speaking nation, so we felt they should be united. Chamberlain, the UK Prime Minister, was somewhat sympathetic towards Germany and felt that the Germans and Austrians had a right to be united, so wouldn't want to intervene. And finally, the UK and France were not prepared to go to war to defend a flawed treaty, so in this case, particularly the UK, corroborated the idea that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, so it was far too harsh, so they wouldn't go to war to try and defend this flawed treaty. Super quick question, why did Hitler want to unite Germany with Austria in the first place? Hitler was Austrian. It also goes with Hitler's foreign policy aims, Lebensraum, more living space, Greater Germany, all German-speaking people should live within Germany. And as we know, Austria is a fundamentally German-speaking nation. Reversal of Versailles, he wanted to prove a point that nobody wanted Versailles to rule over Germany anymore. And this is also one of Hitler's foreign policy aims, you could say. Chamberlain was sympathetic and felt they had the right to unite. Hitler wanted to gain Austrian resources and assets. Why did the UK and France permit the Anschluss in the first place? As we've said, Chamberlain felt they had the right to unite, and he was sympathetic towards Germany. They weren't prepared to go to war over a flawed treaty, as we've said. It was obviously too harsh. The UK thought Versailles was too harsh and sympathized with Germany in general. For instance, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which guaranteed Germany 35% of a navy, the size of that of the UK. The UK and France couldn't agree on how to respond. Obviously, the UK would have been more reluctant to go to war with Germany. France would have been more so. But without the UK support, France obviously wouldn't attack Germany because it needed the UK support. So UK and France couldn't agree. And they could no longer rely on Mussolini to help. This alliance between the UK, France, and Italy fell apart after the November 1936 Rome-Berlin Axis, where Germany and Italy pursued common foreign policy. So the UK and France couldn't rely on Mussolini to help them anymore. So they were more permitting of the Anschluss. I want to look at the Munich Conference, which took place on the 29th of September 1939. And here we have the leaders. Here is Neville Chamberlain for the UK. Here we have Daladier for France. Hitler for Germany. I'll just do GE for Germany. And Benito Mussolini for Italy. And then we have Chiano over here, another Italian foreign minister. But these were the main leaders. And the Munich Conference, Hitler basically just wanted to annex certain areas of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland, and we'll go into more detail. So the Munich Conference permitted German annexation of the Sudetenland, but Czechoslovakia was split up very much. As we can see here, Germany took this entire area. We have Hungary, some Czech territory being given to Hungary. And then we have Czech territory, which is annexed by Poland. So we have a lot of Czechoslovakia is going away by the Munich Conference. So let's go into some more details and the significance of the Munich Conference. So when Hitler actually invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, in March 1939. This crisis led the UK and France to realize that they could no longer appease Hitler and must prepare for war, but that occurs later on. So 3.5 million German speakers lived in the Sudetenland, which is why Hitler wanted to invade the Sudetenland, because of his Greater Germany principle, uniting German speakers, and Lebensraum, so getting more living space. Now the Sudetenland had always been part of Austria-Hungary. It was never previously part of Germany. Unlike the Rhineland, Austria-Hungary, the Sudetenland was never part of Germany. It was always part of Austria-Hungary. The Sudeten Nazi Party was led by Konrad Henlein, a guy named Konrad Henlein. So Hitler encouraged Sudeten Germans to make demands that the Czechoslovakian government wouldn't accept, and it used the same tactic in Austria. So initially, Chamberlain actually met Hitler at Berchtesgaden, which is a German town, on the 15th of September. And Chamberlain agreed to offer Germany areas in which the Sudeten Germans were in a majority, which seemed fair enough. And this offer was subject to approval by the UK, French, and obviously the Czech governments. And not long after, Chamberlain reported agreement by the UK, French, and Czech governments to this meeting, to the offer of agreeing to offer Germany the areas in which the Sudeten Germans were in a majority. The Chamberlain reported agreement by these governments to the offer. Hitler then went on a rampage and demanded all of the rest of the Sudetenlands immediately and to withdraw by the 1st of October or face certainty of war. So then Chamberlain and Daladier, the UK and French prime ministers, then attended the Munich conference in Germany on the 29th of September at the suggestion of Mussolini, who recommended it. They agreed that Germany should indeed have all of the Sudetenland, so they have once again appeased Germany's aggression. So all leaders on their return from Munich were hailed as quote-unquote peacemakers. This is displayed by Neville Chamberlain's Peace for Our Time remark, and only 3 UK MPs actually voted against the Munich Agreement, including Churchill. So noteworthy things is that the USSR and Czechoslovakia were not consulted over the agreement. Obviously, Germany didn't invite them to the conference because Czechoslovakia would be opposed to this annexation of the Sudetenland, and so would the USSR because it feared Germany, and it had common foreign relations with Czechoslovakia. So Hitler's actions actually angered the British and French public, as you can imagine. In October 1938, a poll conducted showed that 93% of British didn't think the Sudetenland was the end of Hitler's territorial ambitions, so they knew he'd want to capture more land. As we have seen, Czechoslovakian territory was also given to Hungary and Poland. So it was also given to Hungary here and Poland over there. And Hitler stated that this was the end of his territorial ambitions. Perhaps he said that beforehand to try and convince the British and French to sign the Munich Agreement. So what was agreed at Munich? So the Sudetenland was to be given to Germany over a 10-day period. Now, there were meant to be plebiscites in those areas where there was uncertainty over who the dominant nationality really was. Was it really Germans? But these were never held. And the four powers would now guarantee the Czechoslovakia's borders once the Polish and Hungarian claims had been met. Let's look at some arguments for and against signing the Munich Agreement. So the first reason for is because the UK wasn't ready for war in 1938. It didn't want to go to a war with Germany just yet. It hadn't built up its army fully. Also, the UK air defences were incomplete and thus vulnerable to the Luftwaffe, the German Luftwaffe. The UK dominions were not in favour of a war, so the UK leaders, the government. And finally, a war would have been seen as a war against self-determination because Germany just really wanted to allow his German-speaking people to be within their own country. So it would have been seen as a war against self-determination. Many of these Sudeten Germans actually wanted to have Germany as their leaders, and they wanted to choose that destiny. Some arguments against signing it: the UK and France abandoned Czechoslovakia. Now, Munich came to be seen as the best example of appeasement. So the Allies were basically giving in to German aggression. If war had broken out, then the UK and France would have been joined and supported by 36 Czech divisions, who were all hiding behind well-prepared defences. In the event of war, the UK and France might have had the assistance of the USSR. And this confirmed the USSR's view. By signing it, you would be confirming the USSR's view that the UK and France were not trustworthy parties, and they wouldn't help if the USSR was attacked by Germany. Here's a question. Why did Chamberlain, on his return from Munich in 1938, say, "I believe it is peace for our time"? So Hitler claimed it was his final territorial ambition. It was the end of his territorial ambition, so there would be nothing more to fear from Germany. Chamberlain was convinced that he had avoided a war, and it was especially good because the UK was not ready for war at that time. Hitler had signed a document to do everything to promote peace. He thought Czechoslovakia was saved from German attacks. And Chamberlain was just desperate to reassure the nation. He also thought he'd achieved self-determination. So the German-speaking people in the Sudetenland wanted to be run by Germany, and that's just self-determination. The freedom to choose the leaders you want. So why did Hitler sign the Munich Agreement? So Hitler wasn't ready for a full-scale war just yet, so he wanted to sign it in a peaceful, legal way. His foreign policy aims were also satisfied, e.g. the Greater Germany uniting all German-speaking people, Lebensraum gaining extra German land, expanding Germany's living space, and autarky, economic self-sufficiency, so getting more access to resources. He also signed it because it was an easy way to gain the Sudetenland. It was an easy way to gain territory without even causing any conflict. So signing it made the takeover seem legal and justified. Signing the Munich Agreement and taking over the Sudetenland would make it inevitably easier to potentially take over the rest of Czechoslovakia in the future, which they eventually did in March 1939. This also improves Hitler's reputation as a successful negotiator, and he does it legally, so that improves his reputation. His actions by signing the Munich Conference also delayed a war, meaning Hitler could continue expanding the German army, as we've said. So appeasement was a popular policy between 1933 and 1939, and it was allowing Germany to pursue its aggressive foreign policy purely to avoid a war with Germany. So an argument for appeasement is the fear of communism. The Allies were more concerned about the spread of communism and dangers posed to the world by Stalin. So many saw Hitler, a strong Germany, as a buffer to the threat of communism. So the memories from the Great War, people wished it was a horrible time, and people wished to avoid another war at all costs. So they just let Hitler do what it wanted. I remember there were 1 million British casualties and 1.5 million French casualties. So we also have the British arms. The British government believed their armed forces were not ready to face war against Hitler. They were weak from the Depression. They were concerned about Hitler's air power. Remember Guernica, the carpet bombing that the Luftwaffe managed to do. They believed they were too weak to fight a war. Their arms were too weak to fight a war against Germany. We also have the United States. The UK wasn't sure that it could face up to the German aggression without the US help. It was too weak. Its military wasn't ready. And remember, in World War I, the Allies struggled before the US intervention in 1917. We also have the Commonwealth, the British Empire. It wasn't guaranteed that the Empire of the Commonwealth would actually support a war against Germany. Remember, there were a lot of losses to the British Empire in World War I, and they might not have wanted to start another war. We also have the Treaty of Versailles as an argument for appeasement. Many felt that Versailles was unfair on Germany, and many of Hitler's demands weren't unreasonable. Just give Germany back what's theirs with the Rhineland. Let them have self-determination and remilitarize, also with Danzig, West Prussia, and Posen. Many people felt Versailles was too harsh, so appeasement was okay. Also, the UK and France had large debts from World War I and large-scale unemployment from the Depression, so they weren't up to fighting a war against Germany again. Arguments against appeasement. You couldn't trust Hitler. After each new move, Hitler said this was all he wanted, yet he often went back on those promises. For instance, in the Munich conference, he actually took over the rest of Czechoslovakia despite saying this was the end of his territorial ambitions. So this is an argument against appeasement. You can't trust Hitler. Don't appease him. We also have the German arms. Germany was rearming publicly and quickly each year. If you didn't stop them now, they'd just keep getting stronger. In conscription in 1935, they'd managed to build up a 600,000 army, 6 times that permitted by Versailles. The more you appease them, the stronger they're going to get, and the bigger their armament is going to become. You also didn't want appeasement because you wanted to make a stand against Hitler. Hitler was a gambler who took increasing risks, and he continued just trying out new things to see if there would be any comebacks. You needed to take a stand against him. Hitler would keep trying until someone stood up to him. Don't let him get away with more and more, like the Rhineland in 1936. You could have stopped him. He was just gambling, and if the French did react to that Rhineland, he would have been forced out, and none of this would have happened. So he was purely just gambling all this time. You need to make a stand against him so he doesn't keep doing this. So you also needed to help the USSR. Hitler made no secret of his plans to expand eastward. Appeasement sent a message to the UK and France. Appeasement sent a message that the UK and France would not stand in Hitler's way if he attacked the USSR. So we need to support the USSR. We need to stand up to Hitler and not let Germany get too strong. This eventually led to the Nazi-Soviet pact, the lack of support here, the lack of assurance to the USSR. Hitler's allies. We also seen that Hitler had observed how his allies had got away with acts of aggression. So this is an argument against appeasement. We don't want to set a precedent that taking over countries is okay. And for instance, in Abyssinia and Manchuria, we need to stop Hitler. So why did the UK and France finally decide to get their act together? Why did they finally end appeasement and try to deter Germany after March 1939? And the main reason is because this is when Germany actually took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. So this proved that Hitler was now seeking to simply enhance German power, not reverse the Treaty of Versailles or unify Germans in any way. So the Germans broke the Munich Agreement. They said this was their final territorial ambition, but it clearly wasn't. So now the UK will end appeasement and deter German aggression by a series of guarantees to countries who felt threatened by Germany. So it was clear now that war was imminent. The UK and France gave their guarantee to Poland to protect them, and also many other countries. There was little the UK and France could do for Czechoslovakia, and Poland was likely to be next on Hitler's list of invasion. And the UK and France actually began thinking of an Eastern alliance, including the USSR, to deter Germany. Obviously, there were problems with this because the USSR didn't really trust the UK and France to help them after all the appeasement they had done to Germany. The USSR believed the UK and France would just watch on the sidelines whilst directing German aggression to the USSR. So there was a problem with kind of thinking of an alliance with the USSR. Which side should the USSR make an agreement with? Britain and France or Germany? So I'm going to read this out because it is rather long. But the British and French perspective, let's look at that first. So the British and French were parliamentary democracies. They greatly distrusted the USSR and saw communism as a threat to their empires. They were happy to preserve the situation in Europe that had been established under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war with Germany in 1919. Britain believed the Red Army had been seriously weakened by the purges. The British and French believed they gave a guarantee to Poland, the most anti-Soviet of the eastern states, in March 1939. Britain would not put pressure on the Poles to give Soviet troops rights of passage across Poland, although France by August 1939 was prepared to do this. It was the stumbling block in the August 1939 negotiations in Moscow. Britain and France did not anticipate a deal between Germany and the USSR. They were prepared to give a guarantee to Poland in response to demands from the British Parliament and public to take action. So they were prepared to give a guarantee to Poland. Okay, what was the Soviets' perspective on an agreement with Britain and France? So this is important. The Soviets suspected that Britain wanted to turn German aggression onto the USSR while it watched from the sidelines, happy to see the Nazis and communists destroy each other. So the Soviets didn't really trust Britain. Britain and France had repeatedly appeased Hitler and shown little enthusiasm for collective security against fascism, so they couldn't be trusted. They had excluded the USSR from the Munich Conference, even though the USSR had treaty obligations to Czechoslovakia. Britain and France had dragged their feet over the Triple Alliance negotiations proposed by Litvinov in 1939. Alliance with Britain and France might not prevent war with Germany, and if it did not, the USSR might bear the brunt of the fighting. Britain and France were not prepared to accept the USSR taking territory or having a sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. Now, what was the German perspective on an agreement with the USSR? Hitler wanted to avoid a war on two fronts, which is why he wanted an agreement with the USSR. A non-aggression pact with Russia would scare off Britain and France. They would not intervene to defend Poland. A non-aggression pact that included promises of Soviet economic help would overcome any Anglo-French blockade. The Allied blockade had been very important in Germany's defeat in the First World War. Agreement was needed in August so that Poland could be defeated before autumn rains. Hitler had no qualms about conceding other countries' territory to Stalin. It would appear to be an ideological somersault. Next to anti-Semitism, anti-communism was Hitler's strongest feeling. But Hitler was very flexible in his tactics. His ultimate aim of defeating the USSR had not changed. Now, the Soviet perspective on an agreement with Germany. A pact with Germany was the only way to be sure of avoiding a war in the West. Soviet security was Stalin's main concern. It would avoid a war on two fronts. The USSR was involved in hostilities with Japan, and Germany had influence with Japan through the Anti-Comintern Pact. Soviet armed forces had been hit by the purges, and the rearmament program was nowhere near completion. A pact with Germany would at least buy Russia some more time. Russia would also gain half of Poland and a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, from Finland to Romania, including the Baltic states. So this is good. Agreement with Germany would be in line with the Treaty of Rapallo and the good relations of 1922 to 1934. Germany was still the USSR's major trading partner. It was Stalin's interest to stand aside while the capitalist nations fought each other. It would appear to be an ideological somersault, a reversal of collective security against fascism. So clearly it was going to turn out that it was good for the Germans to make an agreement with the USSR, and it was good for the USSR to make an agreement with the Germans, so they did so. So what was some of the terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the agreement between the Nazis and the Soviets to carve up half of Poland? And this was in August 1939, almost a month before the war. What were the terms? So both sides pledged not to go to war with each other for 10 years. This is also known as the Non-Aggression Pact. Obviously, it wasn't followed because Hitler invaded the USSR in June 22nd, 1941. So clearly, these agreements really mean nothing. It's the same with the Munich Agreement, where Hitler claimed it was his final territorial ambition. Yet you can't really trust Hitler, and these agreements really mean nothing. But nonetheless, this was one of the terms: not to go to war with each other for 10 years, a non-aggression pact. Both sides pledged neutrality in the event that either became involved in a war. So if one became involved in a war, the other side would just stay neutral. It wouldn't join on a particular side. Secret clauses were provided for the carving up of Poland, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Baltic states. Germany declared it had no interest in the affairs of Bessarabia, which was in Romania, I believe. And Germany would supply the USSR with manufactured goods in the secondary sector in return for raw materials from the USSR, particularly oil. This one with Germany's autarky. So why did the UK and France declare war on the 3rd of September 1939? Well, they'd made an agreement with Poland that they had guaranteed to protect Poland. Appeasement would only allow Germany to become increasingly powerful, so they had to do something. They had to declare war. The UK was now in a better position to declare war, at least a better position than it was in 1938 during the Munich Conference. And we have Germany's refusal to remove troops after the 1st of September ultimatum. When Germany invaded Poland the 1st of September, the UK basically said, hey, Germany, you've got 24 hours to get out of there or we're going to declare war on you. The Germans refused to remove their troops, so they went ahead and declared war. Simple as that. So another reason is because this was part of a process of German expansionism from beyond Versailles. So the Germans took it too far. So even though Germany had legitimate grievances in Danzig and the Polish corridor, this was part of a process of German expansionism that was taken too far, that was beyond Versailles. There was a sense in the UK and France that after the March 1939 takeover of the rest of Czechoslovakia, war was imminent anyway. Now, Hitler was not deterred by the UK and France's guarantee to Poland because the Nazi-Soviet pact meant that the UK and France could not realistically help Poland. It couldn't really fight the Germans and the Soviets. It couldn't really fight them both, so it couldn't realistically help Poland. So it wasn't deterred by its guarantee to Poland. And also because of the lack of UK and French reaction to previous German expansion. There was a lot of appeasement in the past, so they weren't really deterred by the supposed guarantee because there was a lack of reaction in the past. Looking at the causes of World War II, I just want to go over the brief summary, critical evidence that each of these factors was important. So if we're looking at the Treaty of Versailles, this created bitterness and hatred in Germany, and this bitterness and hatred couldn't last forever. And reversal of this treaty was inevitable. We also have the failure of the League of Nations. The failure of the League of Nations. So the collapse of the League led to many conflicts and countries acting in self-interest. The rise of aggressive nationalist leaders, a difficult economic climate which was unwilling to use international sanctions. The failure of collective security encouraged Hitler's actions, and also his allied successful invasions such as Manchuria and Abyssinia. We also have the Depression, the economic worldwide depression, the Great Depression of 1929. This led to chaos in Europe, the ineffectiveness of sanctions. It led to nations being concerned about their own affairs, the rise of aggressive nationalists, and led to votes for NSDAP and Hitler's success. The policy of appeasement led to an aggressive and bold Hitler. It set a precedent of being able to get away with aggression, and it led to an increase in power and encouraged Hitler to make greater demands. We also have the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now, this led to an invasion of Poland, which triggered war. Hitler realized that if he signed an agreement with the USSR, the UK and France wouldn't help Poland because they couldn't fight a war against the Germans and the USSR. So this pact led to the invasion of Poland, which triggered World War II, and it increased Hitler's confidence because he wouldn't have to have a war on two fronts because he was now allies with the USSR, the non-aggression pact. And we also have just Hitler's actions, his foreign policy aims. Hitler's actions. His aggressive foreign policy intent on revoking the Treaty of Versailles led to all the problems in Europe post-1933. All these problems were instigated by Hitler. So these were all the causes of World War II, and it's important to be able to give reasons for each one.